Why did this movie flop? Why do bad movies happen to good people? How can amazing talents come together and make a film that's just an absolute dog? Today we're talking about a big flop that, on paper, seems impossible. In 1983, Sam Raimi and the Coen brothers, literally some of the greatest North American filmmakers to ever exist, collaborated on a movie called Crimewave. The studio sees a rough cut and loses all faith in the production. They put it into 7 theaters, dooming it to make a grand total of just $5,000. After exploding onto the scene with a low-budget smash, Raimi and Co. seem to fall victim to the dreaded sophomore slump. But is that all there is to it? No, of course not. And to crack this case, we're going to have to go all the way back. 1982. Riding high off the success of their first feature, The Evil Dead, Sam Raimi and friends Rob Tapert, Bruce Campbell, and Scott Spiegel seek to make the jump into Hollywood pictures. Raimi has an idea called Relentless for their next one, and he calls up his friends Joel and Ethan Coen to flesh it out into a full screenplay. In 1983, the screenplay is done and the group is taking meetings. No offer is more enticing than Avco Embassy's offer of $2.5 million. Avco Embassy is a smaller studio known for low-budget, action-y schlock, and they had just found great success with The Fog and Escape from New York. Raimi and Co. were hot at the moment from Evil Dead, and in October, the deals are all signed. Raimi's team wants to shoot in their native Detroit, and after a short battle, the studio begrudgingly obliges. They shoot a proof-of-concept scene starring Bruce Campbell as the lead, and the studio says no. Bruce Campbell will not be allowed to star in this film. This is the first no that the group has heard. They raised $400K for Evil Dead and then went and shot it in the faraway woods. With Crimewave, they are immediately greeted with a more involved financial backer. At this point, it's called Relentless, but producer Irvin Shapiro tells them that they need an X in the title to attract eyes, and the word murder would also go a long way. So then, naturally, Relentless becomes the XYZ Murders and stays that way throughout production. Halloween night 1983, shooting begins. Because the film takes place over a single night, it requires a brutal schedule. They shoot in the dead of night, 6 nights a week, in extreme Michigan cold. Raimi's boundless ambition and incredible eye for cinematic fun takes full advantage of a budget that the team doesn't fully understand. He likes the look of wind on film, so they fly in a bunch of airboats from the Florida Bayou. They smash cars, they build a lot of sets, they smash some of the sets, they even smash a stuntman or two. When a shot looking over a bridge at the water below is needed and the water's frozen, the stuntmen detonate primer cord all over the ice. But with traditional sums of Hollywood money come traditional scores of Hollywood problems, and the extreme night temperatures are making everybody sick. Ambulances begin standing by on set in case of hypothermia. The unit production manager gets fired for trying to get a gun through airport security. The lead actor is injured and drops out on the first day, and they have to fly Reed Birney in to replace him. Paul Smith will simply not do what is being asked of him. His entire voice is dubbed over in the final cut. Louise Lasser becomes convinced that her makeup artists are incompetent, keeps barring herself in her trailer. Brian James removes every bit of electrical from his hotel room. The studio reviews the footage at the end of each day and installs a representative on set who must sign off on all further expenses. The representative is angered when he watches the cinematographer take 30 takes to get a crane shot just right. And when reviewing the footage, they complain that Campbell and Spiegel are seen shemping too much. January 18th, 1984, shooting wraps on the XYZ Murders. Shortly after, the studio sees an assembly cut and panics. They take the cut away from Raimi and relocate editing to LA. But Raimi and Co. fly to LA in pursuit of their film. An exec says the film should be told in flashbacks, no further explanation, so a giant wave of expensive reshoots is scheduled. Raimi gets editing back and finishes out the reshoots as director, to no avail. The studio still hates the film. The marketing department changes the name to Crimewave and they try to sell it to HBO. But because that sale requires a minimum theatrical stretch, They're forced to dump it onto 7 screens in Kansas and Alaska with little to no marketing. It's doomed to make a grand total of $5,000. It gets savaged by most critics. Avco Embassy collapses shortly after. Raimi disowns the end product and calls it incomprehensible. The Coen brothers actively omit it on their resumes. Campbell remarks that the film wasn't released, it escaped. Now that we have all the facts, let's proceed into our findings, and I think it's a great case because it includes a lot of the fundamental flop factors. The first factor is obviously the studio. I think I might say that in every single one. The first factor is obviously the studio. It was true. They lost faith in the deal, in the movie, and we've seen dropped releases on the show before, you know. It's impossible to even break even on $2.5 million in 7 theaters, and it's a guaranteed big flop because of that. But Avco Embassy lost faith in the deal because they knew they had rushed into the deal. It's another case of hot right now syndrome. This happens. This is Hollywood, right? So you book your next gig before your current gig even opens in Hollywood. You take advantage of your own hype that way and the reactionary nature of the industry. Raimi and co were hot off Evil Dead, so there was a bidding war for the next movie and everyone was throwing money at it. And Avco Embassy won the bidding war, and there was no careful consideration. They just jumped to the green light because they were hot right now. Now, this film was a critical flop on top of a commercial one, and that's partially, anyway, because of the reshoots. I mean, if we're talking an original film, not made by committee, and with people who are actually trying, a studio cannot make such a film better with reshoots. Avco Embassy hated the film when they saw it, and while they might, you know, a studio can think a movie is bad and be right about that, a studio can make a movie more marketable and more successful with reshoots, but a studio cannot add creative value. But the makers have to take some of the blame here, and right next to hot right now is what else you got. You know, if your hype meter is high and you're considered a strong writer in Hollywood, I feel like studios just go, what else you got? They put into production and buy whatever underdeveloped ideas or like writing exercises you have on your desk. You see this a lot in sophomore efforts. You see this a lot in movies like, for example, no offense, The Belko Experiment and Brightburn, you know? Not only was the studio in a rush to sign Raimi, but they were buying whatever, you know, cocktail napkin scribbles he was selling, no offense. And it's definitely a half-baked concept. Raimi got the Coens to punch up this bizarre idea to screenplay length, and it was a lot darker and more violent, by the way, when they wrote it. And he converted that into some kind of like Three Stooges thing. It's underdeveloped, and it probably wasn't worth such a commitment. Yeah, they're young and inexperienced, and the set was a disaster too, which plays a huge role. You know, they had no experience herding LA actors. One of the lead actresses, Cherie Wilson, she put it best when she said that a more experienced crew would have known the perils they were setting up for themselves by filming the whole thing at night and shooting and not foreseeing that Detroit would be super cold those months. It's difficult to go from chump change in the woods to the multi-million-dollar big time where you have these like corporate types interfering with the creative process, you know, and this is Raimi's first lesson in corporate dance, and in a lot of ways, Sam Raimi's career is defined by that. I mean, he made the Spider-Man movies under Sony, the worst studio of modern time, you know. Look at Spider-Man 3. Spider-Man 3 is one of the clearest cases of a director sort of throwing up his hands in frustration and just taking every studio note that they were giving him. Spider-Man 3 is probably the most transparently studio notified movie to ever exist. But the road to cinema hell is paved with cinema good intentions. Perhaps the most valuable lesson in Crimewave is not necessarily about the studio battles that you have to do. And maybe the better lesson is about the underdeveloped idea you commit to in the first place. Maybe it's about knowing where your heart is actually in something or when you're just forcing it. Case closed.